In this video, we are going to discuss aerobic and anaerobic respiration and the differences between them. What do these processes mean? Aerobic respiration is going to involve oxygen, and it's going to produce cellular energy in the form of ATP for our bodies. Anaerobic respiration occurs when oxygen is not present or absent or limited, and it's still going to produce energy for our bodies, but not as much and in a different way. So in overall, both of these processes are going to produce ATP energy by taking that food, that glucose that was either made in photosynthesis or in heterotrophs, where the food is eaten or consumed. The main thing to know about cellular respiration is that it occurs in both plants and animals because we all need energy. It also occurs in bacteria as well, but not in the certain organelle that we're going to be talking about. So aerobic respiration occurs in the mitochondrion, single form of mitochondria. Inside of that mitochondrion, 3 steps are going to take place. We have glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. These 3 steps make up the process of aerobic respiration. It's going to make ATP by breaking down that glucose that was made before. So down here is the full equation for aerobic respiration. We have the glucose here, C6H12O6, and oxygen is being taken in. And then we are producing, on the right side of the arrow, we are producing carbon dioxide, water, and the main thing to know is that it's producing energy. So aerobic respiration is how we get our energy. It helps us move around and do everything we need to do in our everyday lives. Your first keyword is respiration. Here you're going to label your mitochondrion. On your notes, you're going to label the different parts of it. So there's the outer membrane on the outside of the mitochondrion. We have the inner membrane here. There's 2 membranes in a mitochondrion. These folds are called cristae, and this inside part here is called the matrix. That is the very inside where it looks like there's kind of a watery substance in there. And then between the inner membrane and the outer membrane is called the inner membrane space. So as stated before, glycolysis is the first step of respiration, of aerobic respiration. Glycolysis is a certain type of meaning, so right here we have glycose, which means sweet, and then lysis means to split apart. So you're actually going to be splitting apart that sweet glucose, sugar, that was taken in or made in photosynthesis. So this part actually does not occur inside the mitochondria. It actually occurs on the outside, which is in the cytoplasm of the cell. Okay, so right here, cytoplasm, that's the jelly-like material on the outside of the cell. During this process, glucose is going to be broken down into 2 molecules that are then going to be called pyruvic acid. So right here you have glucose, and it's going to be broken down into 2 molecules of pyruvic acid. So you see that glucose was made of 6 carbons here, and it's going to be cut in half basically, and it's going to have 3 carbons over here and 3 carbons over here, and those 2 are called pyruvic acids. This process does not require oxygen, okay, but it does need energy to get started. So it's going to need the input of certain ATP molecules in order to begin. So you actually put in 2 ATPs to get started, and then at the end it's going to make 4 ATP. So kind of going over some math for this. So you made 4 ATP at the end, but you already used 2 to get started. So you would do 4 minus 2, and really the process only makes 2 ATP because you already had to use 2 to get started, but you ended up with 4. So overall the process of glycolysis only makes 2 ATP even though you think that it makes 4. Okay. That is called a net gain of 2 ATP, and it also produces an energy carrying molecule called NADH, and it makes 2 of those. The second process is called the Krebs cycle. It's the second process of aerobic respiration. It occurs in the matrix of the mitochondria, and it takes those 2 pyruvic acids that were made in glycolysis, it breaks them down to make carbon dioxide, ATP, and 2 more energy carrying molecules called FADH and NADH. They're going to carry the energy to the next process in aerobic respiration. So here's what it's going to make for 1 pyruvic acid, but it's really going to make this much per glucose molecule because you broke that glucose molecule into 2 pyruvic acids. So this is the part that you want to be looking at over here on this side, because it's going to break down both of those pyruvic acids, which was 1 glucose. So in overall, for the Krebs cycle, it makes 6 carbon dioxides, which gets released into the air, and then the plants are going to retake that in for photosynthesis. It makes 2 ATP molecules, 2 FADH2 molecules, and 8 NADH molecules. Your second keyword is makes. The third process of aerobic respiration is the electron transport chain. This occurs in the inner membrane of the mitochondria, or in those cristae. So you can see that it is in the membrane right here with those phospholipids. You can see all the different proteins in there that are going to help with the assistance of the electron. And then you have this enzyme over here, which I'll talk about in a minute. So those high energy molecules that were made in the Krebs cycle, called FADH2 and NADH, they're going to carry their excited electrons over here, and they're going to release them into this chain right here. You can see their electrons traveling down the chain then. It's kind of like a train. And as it's doing that, these H hydrogen protons are going to be pumped through the membrane. They're going to be excited, and then they're going to come over here to this molecule, an enzyme called ATP synthase, and synthase means to make. So those protons are going to be pumped back through, and they're going to turn ADP into ATP by adding that proton back on. So this molecule means to make ATP, and it's going to make ATP at the end. That is the main goal of aerobic respiration. 36 to 38 ATP molecules are made per glucose molecule. Okay, so only 1 glucose makes 36 to 38 ATP during this process, and that's a lot. So we want to get that as much glucose made. That's why we need to eat a lot. And keep our energy flowing. So this is the big picture here. There's a picture of this on your notes. So glycolysis happens on the outside of the mitochondria and the cytoplasm. It takes in the glucose. It makes pyruvic acid, makes 2 ATP also, and then it goes inside the mitochondria for the Krebs cycle, and the Krebs cycle also makes 2 ATP, and then those energy carrying molecules are going to bring their electrons to the electron transport chain, and that electron transport chain is the main part of aerobic respiration, and it makes 32 to 34 ATP, And total, adding all of those up, you're going to get 36 to 38 ATP total, okay, per 1 glucose molecule. Your third keyword is ATP. All right, now that we have talked about aerobic respiration, now we are going to talk about anaerobic respiration, and this occurs in the absence of oxygen. So how do we get our ATP energy when oxygen is not available for us? This happens when we are exercising a lot and our body isn't getting enough oxygen as we need, when we're breathing really heavy, and certain foods don't get oxygen all the time. So this is what we're going to talk about in here. So we have a process called fermentation is going to allow glycolysis to continue making ATP when oxygen is not available. So there's going to be two types of fermentation we're going to talk about, but you can see that glycolysis is still going to happen because glycolysis does not need oxygen to perform. So it just needs that glucose, and then it's going to go into fermentation instead of going into cellular respiration when it needed oxygen here. It's going to go through fermentation when oxygen is not available. Your fourth keyword is energy. So just a little review, glycolysis splits glucose into two pyruvic acids, but then the pyruvic acid and the NADH are going to enter the fermentation process, not the Krebs cycle this time. And fermentation is going to allow glycolysis to continue producing ATP. Fermentation itself does not produce ATP, but it allows glycolysis to continue by producing more NAD+, okay, for the glycolysis to use. So that's a main point to remember, that fermentation itself does not produce ATP, but it allows glycolysis to continue by producing that NAD+. So the two types of fermentation, here is one type. This is alcoholic fermentation. This occurs in certain yeasts and certain other microorganisms. They also use alcoholic fermentation. So the pyruvate is broken down into alcohol and carbon dioxide. So that's why it's called alcoholic fermentation. So you can kind of remember that it produces alcohol, so it's called alcoholic fermentation. It also makes carbon dioxide, which gets released in air bubbles in certain things such as beer and wine. You can see air bubbles floating up. And then also in bread. This is why bread rises, because it's producing that carbon dioxide. Your fifth keyword is FOR, F-O-R. Here is the chemical equation for alcoholic fermentation. So the pyruvic acid and NAD+ is taken in, and it's going to produce alcohol, CO2, and more NAD+ to go back into glycolysis again, so it can produce more ATP. The second type of fermentation is called lactic acid fermentation. This occurs in some bacteria and in some animal cells, which uses lactic acid fermentation. It occurs in animal muscle cells when the tissue requires energy at a faster rate, when oxygen isn't being supplied enough, like I said. It also uses to convert lactose into lactic acid in yogurt and in some cheese to give it that sour taste and to ferment vegetables such as pickles. So here's the equation for the lactic acid fermentation. It starts off the same as alcoholic fermentation. It takes in pyruvic acid and the NADH, but this time it's going to produce lactic acid and more NAD+. So the same as alcoholic fermentation, the name is kind of in its product. Here's lactic acid, and lactic acid fermentation is the name. So it kind of goes together with the name and the products. Your sixth keyword is all. Do you ever wonder why your muscles get sore after you work out a lot? That is actually lactic acid being produced in your muscle cells. So, like I said, lactic acid is a product of lactic acid fermentation. So, when your body isn't getting enough oxygen, it's going to start going through lactic acid fermentation to produce more ATP rapidly during strenuous exercise, and then it's going to have that byproduct of lactic acid, and that lactic acid actually makes your muscles sore from that fermentation. So in this example here, in this picture, you can see this person grabbing their muscle because it hurts. So the lactic acid actually is going to accumulate in there, and it's going to cause some cramping and pain. Lactic acid can supply enough ATP to last about 90 seconds. For exercise longer than 90 seconds, aerobic respiration is the only way to continue generating the supply of ATP. So lactic acid fermentation only occurs in like quick energy, like if you're going to sprint across a field. But if you're going to run a marathon, your body might go into lactic acid fermentation at first, but once your body gets used to running and your body gets in a rhythm, it's going to go back into aerobic respiration. Okay, here I'm going to move me out of the picture here, but you can fill this in. This is the chart comparing aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Please fill this in. It is very important for you to know. And that's it. If you have questions, please ask. These are very complex processes, so it's very important for you to know the difference between them and the processes within their own kind, like aerobic and anaerobic. And your seventh keyword is cells.